Good morning, Vikings fans. This is Morning Joe's, or should I say Morning Joe, as I am Joe Johnson, and I am here by myself. Typically, I'm here with at least one other person, that other person being Joe Oberly, and we have been having guests on the show here and there. But Joe was out, and the fill-in host for the show canceled last minute, so I am here. I am by myself, and I am terrified. I really just wanted to do a quick show. I thought about maybe just canceling the show since a lot of this is about differing views, debating the team, and there's a lot to debate at this point in the season. But I wanted to talk about an article that I wrote yesterday. For those of you that don't know, I am the owner of both Purple PTSD and VikingsTerritory.com. I wanted to point that out because I got a lot of emails to Vikings Territory yesterday, basically asking whom it may concern to forward messages to me that basically either I should kill myself or not quit my day job, and unfortunately this is my day job, or at least I'm trying to make it be my day job, as are the 15 or so writers that work with me on both Purple PTSD and VikingsTerritory.com, and I've been covering the team from a writer perspective really since 2015. Before that, I was really heavy on different Vikings-related media boards, namely Reddit. And so I've been debating the team for a while. I'm not unfamiliar with people emotionally reacting to some of the takes that I have, or feeling that perhaps I am putting out not negative opinions, but unpopular opinions. And with that in mind, I wrote an article yesterday about Zimmer being on the hot seat. I think the title was "Zimmer's Seat is Starting to Warm." That was something that I had felt was going around, not necessarily internally between the writers on our site, but if you've listened to other shows that we've done or watched the post-game show of the Rams game with about the labor guys on Vikings territory, you get a general sense that, things aren't going obviously as planned, that the defense really since halftime of the Saints game has been objectively god-awful. It feels like Zimmer, who is the king of adjustments, especially halftime adjustments, has been unable to adjust to what the teams have been throwing his way, really since the Eagles game. And my biggest fear after the Eagles game, obviously, was that the team would implode and fall apart this season, since, at the age of 34, outside of the NFC Championship game they made in the late 80s when I wasn't really conscious of football, they've always kind of had a really terrible season. The season after they've lost an NFC Championship game, 1999, 2002, 2010, those have all been disasters. Looking at bringing in Kirk Cousins, Sheldon Richardson, the hope was that they reset the narrative, that the defense especially wouldn't dwell on how badly they performed against the Eagles, that they wouldn't, have that mentality that they had last year as a cohesive unit wouldn't be shattered. I said this after the Eagles game, that, this defense needs a leader, that this team doesn't seem to have the heart to perform in big games. And I hoped, again, that, bringing in Kirk Cousins on offense would help, that bringing in Sheldon Richardson would help. And it doesn't seem like, this team is able to make any adjustments. It feels Norv Turner-ian in its inability to really overcome what these teams are throwing its way. I think, really, first of all, let me explain the article. The article was something that, I picked up on people saying to me or saying about the team, but not explicitly saying it, teasing it. Then I saw an article by Charlie Walters in the Pioneer Press, which is linked in the article itself, that basically states that, should the season continue to go sideways, let's say the Vikings go 7-8-1, would they then let John DeFilippo leave for a head coaching gig somewhere else, or would they say, okay, we've put a ton of money into this team, we've built them a brand new headquarters, we've let the coach basically have carte blanche in regards to the draft, almost like a college coach would have, as Zimmer's fingerprints are on almost every player on this defense. Or do we stick with the guy who clearly has reached his full potential? I do think that, in responding to that, my point was, I expanded on it a little bit. I said, well, you could say that. You could also find fault with Rick Spielman in his inability to maybe let Zimmer know that, hey, there's an offense on the other side of the ball, and maybe we don't need to spend, the biggest contract ever for a quarterback unless we want to protect him with the offensive line, something they haven't done. But I don't think that the owners are going to look at Spielman and want to change that. I feel like that would be an admission of a rebuild, and this team clearly doesn't need to rebuild. They have all these players locked in for years to come, so you have to think, where does the buck stop? Again, assuming that they don't turn things around. That was the entire point. The article ended with, this very well could be hyperbolic nonsense. After the Vikings lost 2 of their first 4 games last season, there was a lot of similar emotions based on different circumstances. There was the Vikings lost the week after Bradford went down, and then they lost the week after Cook went down. And a lot of people are saying that the team, obviously is reeling from the Everson Griffin situation, and that they'll overcome that. But the difference between that last year's situation and this is that these things extend till before Everson Griffin left. They extend to, again, the second half of the Saints game and the entire Eagles game. And they're seemingly getting worse. I don't think there was a narrative last season where it was like, okay, we might suck because Bradford's gone on Case Keenum. Like, what are we going to do? That clearly didn't end up happening. That's not how we're talking right now. We're talking about a defense that was number one in so many categories last season and then gave up 560 some yards offense against the Rams. And to have people say, well, yeah, it's the Rams, though. They're like the best team in football. And it's like, well, weren't we considered to be the best team in football also? To me, that's a depressing justification. To say, oh, yeah, well, sure, we got shit kicked, but it was against a great team. Well, what does that mean for the playoffs? I don't know. I just don't understand that. And then to hear, well, it was a short week. It was a short week for the Rams also, and apparently they could do whatever they wanted to us on offense, and that's something that, I think is summed up perfectly by Zimmer himself, who I saw an article that says Zimmer, worried about the pass defense, and basically he said he didn't know what the problem was. That's super telling to me. That makes me feel like things are going to get worse before they get better. And trust me, I don't, despite the fact that the site is called purpleptsd.com, I'm not negative for the sake of being negative. I don't post things for the sake of clicks. Our site doesn't work that way. I hold the reputation of our sites in very high regard, and I wouldn't post something just to get clicks randomly after 2.5 years of doing the exact opposite. But it feels like, to me, this defense just, you look at, let's say it's a personnel issue, that it's not the scheme, And it's just the fact that, yeah, you can say Barr played horribly, but Barr was also lined up against wide receivers in the Rams game. I was watching the game, and I remember the color commentator saying, well, let's see what Zimmer dials up at halftime. Let's see what adjustments he makes as this great, defensive mind who is going to make adjustments. And it seemed like there weren't any adjustments. Nothing changed. Barr was still covering wide receivers in the second half. And even if it was 100% personnel, the players suddenly just got really bad. Xavier Rhodes, he has played not like Xavier Rhodes plays, that is an issue, and it doesn't all, I'm not saying it's all scheme. I don't know football well enough, as many of you told me. I didn't play football outside of 1 year playing for Falwell Park in North Minneapolis, where we won the city championship. But I quit because of my bronchitis. Woo! I don't know the X's and O's well enough to tell you, but I do know that if you look at the Pro Football Focus grades, Pro Football Focus is a sponsor of this show. These players are playing at a level that none of us saw coming this season. And when you think about that, it still falls. The buck has to stop somewhere, and that would have to go back to Zimmer as well, because it's his job to get these guys to play up to their potential. And if they're not doing that, I really, like Zimmer doesn't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix it. What do you do outside of making a change? And I don't want that to happen. I'm not rooting for that. I said in my article I would love to be wrong. But I feel like, yes, the schedule is difficult too. But that means that everyone in the NFC North has a similarly difficult schedule. At the same time, we played these teams last year. We dominated the Rams last year defensively. And, I feel like all of the responses that I got were basically, for people that disagreed with me anyway, were A, I don't play football, B, I don't watch football, so I spend about 16 hours a day on football websites, but I actually don't watch the games. Spoiler alert. Other than that, there were some well thought out responses, I guess. A lot of people were just saying, how dare you say that about Zimmer? He's done more for this team. He's overachieved. That was one. I agree. He took the 3-13 team around. He did do that. But some schemes and some coaches only have a certain level that they can reach eventually. And, when NFL teams have enough tape against certain players that might start out super strong, they end up, hitting a plateau because the teams have enough of a sample size to really analyze what they're doing and stop it. And I just feel like, in my heart of hearts, that the NFL has figured out how to beat the Vikings. And that started with Doug Peterson, really. You can look back to Drew Brees and the coach I won't name because he's a cheater as well. But, I think by passing on first and second down, the Vikings have decent third down numbers, but they're getting just destroyed on first and second down. And you can look at Anthony Barr, you can look at Mackenzie Alexander, and all of that. But clearly, by not adjusting to it at halftime in the Rams, it was just super telling to me that perhaps Zimmer's double-A gap blitz scheme has been exposed. I've heard that from so many people. Zimmer's exposed. And then I see Charlie Walters write about the potential for him, at the end of the season, making a change. And so I guess I was a little surprised by the just incredible amount of activity the article ended up getting. It's like 40,000 clicks. It got picked up by a few aggregating sites, and clearly it struck a nerve with some people. But no one had explicitly said that outside of Charlie Walters, I guess. And so maybe that's why people were surprised or angry and invoked some sort of response. But I've heard from multiple podcasts that Zimmer's been exposed. So the key really boils down to, can he fix it? Does he know enough to fix it? They're obviously, the NFL is geared towards the offense. It has been increasingly so. It has been, really since that owner of the Colts, the guy that pops pills, I forget his name, Irsay, wanted to make changes because he couldn't beat the Patriots. And so maybe having a team where you put so much into the defense wasn't the best move in the first place. I've harped on the offensive line for years. I'm a Big Ten apologist. I've always wondered how Spielman's kid can go to a Big Ten school and they don't end up looking at the Big Ten as much for offensive linemen. I mean, that's what they're really good for. You look at other conferences in college, the Big 12, Pac-10, they play these arena football type offenses. They spread the ball around a lot. Their offensive linemen are my size at biggest, and I'm 6'3", 275 pounds. And then you end up, this was probably pre-Spielman. It might have been the triangle of authority, but you end up getting a guy from Slippery Rock when Wisconsin is, attached to us. That's something, and that ties into the next point, which is the offense. I was a really big Kirk Cousins guy. I think the biggest argument in regards to emotion that's ever happened on the Purple Journal podcast, which is just a show that I do with Joe Oberle and Luke Braun, was about Kirk Cousins. And, I feel like at this point we're both kind of right about the things that we saw. I will give Luke credit for, bringing up the fact that Cousins has pretty bad pocket presence and awareness. That's something that, and this isn't a dig at Luke at all, but if Luke knew it, then the team knows it, or at least they should. And so, what do you do when you pay somebody that much money and bring him in to lead your team, and you have limited cap space after that because of obviously that contract and the guys on defense you're trying to sign, but you do have draft picks. You draft another corner? It just doesn't... I know what they were thinking. I know that they didn't want to draft a guard in the first round, perhaps. They could have traded down a few spots, gotten 2 higher picks in the second round, and ended up getting a guy like, I forget the guy's name, but from Iowa, he went 39th overall, who could have immediately played in Compton's spot. But instead, they rolled the dice and said, okay, let's go with this guy that we really like on defense, and then because of the amount of guards available, we'll be able to pick one up with our second pick, and that didn't end up happening. I know that O'Neal has played admirably when he's been in, but he's a tackle, and clearly the guards are killing us. Compton, I think, has been getting just murdered, and Reef next to him has been playing bad as well, and I think a lot of it has to do with who's next to him. But I'm not apologizing for Cousins either. I mean, he should know at this point in his career what just logic dictates. If you're standing back there for that long, there's probably somebody coming, so get rid of the ball faster. He has a reputation of getting the ball, going through his progressions relatively quickly, so I don't know if he's just waiting for somebody to get open or what the problem is. But, above and beyond all the problems with the defense, this fumbling problem is something that you can foresee really hurting the team come the playoffs. That's just, it dug a hole for the team early in the Bills game, and I'm not going to blame that all on the offensive line. But the line has been brutal. I mean, it's hard to say with just the way things have gone how bad the line has been, especially in the run game. They've given Cousins seemingly enough time in enough situations for him to, stay in the game against the Rams, who have a really, really scary defensive line. They were going score for score, basically, and so you got to give him credit there. And you also have to say, well, with the offensive line, you can't really run the ball when you are down by 14, 17 points like they were against the Bills. You can't really dictate the speed of the game like they did last season when you're down by that many points that quickly. But at this point, there is absolutely zero balance between the passing game and the running game. I think Cousins broke the record for the most yards in the first quarter of the season for any Vikings quarterback, besting Culpepper, who had that amazing 2004. I think that was the year that he got so cocky that he said at the Pro Bowl that he didn't really mind or need, the offense didn't need Randy Moss to come back. And then, that played out. That was probably one of the lowest moments in Vikings history, to be honest. But, as I said about Cousins, he is capable of getting 5,000 yards for this team. But do we want him to? Is that a good thing, or is that a sign that something is wrong with the running game? Not to say that you can't have both. Clearly that's what Breeze was doing, but last season he didn't reach nearly the numbers that he typically did, but that's because of the emergence of Kamara and the balance that they have there with Ingram. The Vikings were looking to do the same thing, and I just don't think that even... I don't know. I don't think they have the offensive line to make a push to really do what the team wants to do, which is slow the game way down to pick up chunk yardage on first and second down with runs or screens, have third and shorts, and then let the defense go out there and force 3 and outs and really just control the clock, control time of possession, control the field. They've done none of that, and it's hard to really harp on them because of the situations that they've been in, and I get that, and I've heard that in response to my Zimmer piece too, but at the same time, the Packers held the Bills to 0 points. And the Vikings defense of last year, even if they started in the red zone twice, they would have held them to a field goal on one of those, or both of them. They wouldn't have let a rookie quarterback scramble for 2 touchdowns. They wouldn't have given 12 additional points beyond that. Everyone was... I think people were saying, well, they slept on the Bills, and the Bills are actually a lot better. They're a playoff team, and they're going to be good now because it's the emergence of Josh Allen. And then you look at what the Packers did, and then you look at Aaron Rodgers saying how bad the offensive game plan was, and they still won by 22 points. That's the stuff that makes me feel like, okay, this season is officially going sideways. And unfortunately, being a pessimist about the Vikings, which I'm not, really, you're right 100% of the time thus far. Through 50-plus seasons, you're going to be right if you're negative. There's a reason I don't do post-game shows, because I do get very angry about when the Vikings lose, and sad at the same time. Sangry, which makes me want to drink sangria. But for people to I just don't understand this emotional, threatening optimism when you look at the track record of this team. I was just talking to a friend of my dad's who combined are really responsible for the mutated human being I am in regards to football. Him and my dad used to always make me block when I was a kid, and they called me Sapolo for Jesse Sapolo, who was a guard for the 49ers back in the day. And he basically told me this morning, as I was trying to get him to come on the show, he's in Montana though, so he couldn't make it, that he's seen this movie for 50 years, and it always has the same ending. And And so I get a little irked when people will say, well, don't you watch football? And how dare you? And it's like, well, clearly I watch football, and clearly it upsets me. Because clearly it always ends up with the same results. I don't see logically how you can make an argument other than what I'm doing. And it sucks. But to hear Zimmer say that he doesn't know what's wrong with the passing defense is telling, and something that I would love to edit my article and add at the beginning. But mainly, again, not to keep defending the article or anything, but it did go semi-viral, and so I do want to talk about it. It's, I was analyzing what Charlie Walters said, and the main crux of that, again, is beyond what I already discussed, was that the NFL has a youth movement. You got Sean McVay, who's 2 years younger than me, and then you look at Zimmer, who's, 60, and then you have a guy who is eventually going to be a head coach in John DeFilippo, and he's 40. Who do you bet on if the Vikings don't reach the playoffs or even win a playoff game? I think you got to look at what the bar is for this season with the money that the Wolves have spent on the team internally and externally. Externally meaning the head coaches over in Egan. They're going to make a move, and they're not going to... Getting rid of Spielman, they're not going to do that because Spielman is still widely considered to be one of the greatest GMs in the NFL. I have issues with some of the decisions that he's made, clearly, but to get rid of him would admit a complete rebuild, and I don't think this team needs a complete rebuild. I just think it needs someone to come in to do things differently. Does that include keeping George Edwards? I don't know. A lot of people have said maybe Edwards should start doing more play calling for Zimmer. That could be an option. If that happens, that's a huge sign, by the way. That's Zimmer cannot make the proper adjustments, and that he's probably done. Norv Turner retired because he couldn't make the adjustments with the personnel on the field. I think this is different because we do have the right personnel. It's just, again, it's a scheme thing. And maybe a motivation thing. Maybe the players just aren't buying into what Zimmer's selling anymore. There was some talk the season before last about Zimmer, the way, he had to sit down with Greenway to talk about the way that he discusses the team with the media. And that could have a big part to do with it. Look at the way that some people reacted to the way that Zimmer reacted to Daniel Carlson missing those kicks. He was pretty cut and dry in regards to how he felt about that. I don't fault him for that personally at all, but maybe that's something that, clearly I'm a little more blunt than most people are. But maybe that the players are kind of feeling like Rhett and Ricky Ellison said, that it's a toxic environment. I haven't heard anything about that. I'm just kind of spitballing, but I'm trying to figure out really why this defense is not performing at the level that it did before. So regardless, though, of whether it's scheme or players, again, the buck stops somewhere. We haven't also discussed Everson Griffin, his statement, and what that means for the team. I find it interesting that there's been reports that the team is looking at different defensive ends. I think they signed one today or yesterday, but that person wasn't Brian Robeson, who you'd expect they might bring back in lieu of Everson Griffin. I'm not sure why that is. I'm going to look into that and probably write an article about it. But Griffin basically said that, he needs time to figure out what's going on, and that there's no timetable for his return. The most telling part of that was that these are issues he's dealt with for, quote-unquote, a long time. And it's really interesting because you look at him as a guy that, I've met him at training camp. He's... I've been part of media scrums that he's been in. He seems like such a great guy. I know Joe Oberly shared an anecdote from a couple weeks ago that, Joe was at. He was the editor for Minnesota Golf Magazine. So he was at this golf event that Everson Griffin was also at, and they talked for, 5-10 minutes. Griffin's kids were there. He was completely jovial and fine. And then about 10 minutes later, Joe saw him again and said, "Hey, you ready to tee off?" And he said that Griffin was like a completely different person. Cold, sort of rude, just kind of discarded him a little bit. And so that was something for him that was telling that maybe something was going on. And, maybe for a guy that was just there with his kids, he doesn't want to get bothered by everybody, and I'm sure he was. Maybe he just, we're reading into something a little bit more just because of the situation, but it doesn't sound like he's coming back anytime soon. And you can't fault him for that. As somebody who's personally dealt with anxiety and depression and PTSD, hence the name of the site, it's something that you hear people say, what does he have to be depressed about? You don't want to speculate on stuff like this, but there could be larger issues in regards to concussions as well. But depression is a disease, and it doesn't matter how your life is going. Your life, a lot of it can be, when someone reaches rock bottom. But it doesn't matter if you're a millionaire, if you have a great marriage, or if you're homeless and nobody likes you. And so it's great the team is supporting him, and that they're giving him a wide berth and letting him figure this stuff out for himself while providing what he needs in regards to healthcare and everything. And people say that maybe that's why the defense is falling apart. And I don't know. I don't feel like that's the reason. I don't want to compare negative situations really, but if the team was going to fall apart, they would have fallen apart after Bradford went out, or after Cook went out after Bradford, but they didn't. And so losing Griffin, who is a leader on the defense, but you have multiple leaders. You still have Linval Joseph. You still have Sheldon Richardson, who's new but is very, very vocal from what I've seen at training camp and from what I've heard from other people. Harrison Smith, Kendricks, maybe Barr. I know Barr's captain. And so that just seems like a scapegoat to me. And it just doesn't pass muster. I also wanted to touch a little bit on I guess we could just, I was going to grade the first quarter with Jordan, who was going to guest host, or with Joe. I'm going to save that for Friday. But I wanted to just maybe look at the offense a little bit more and see how sustainable that is. Outside of the fumbles, you have to really be happy with what they're doing. Diggs and Thielen are so freaking good, and I know I've ripped on Spielman in regards to how much attention he's given the offense in the draft, and I do feel like he really did luck out with those two. You got Diggs, a 5th round guy who would have been higher, but he had some injuries at Maryland. I was a huge Diggs guy. I called him the steal of the draft immediately. Again, I'm a Big Ten guy. That was, I think, the first year that Maryland was added to the Big Ten, so maybe he was kind of an ex post facto Big Ten type guy for a legal term. And then, obviously, Thielen was a guy that came to a tryout. He's a local guy. And neither of those guys were drafted high like a Treadwell. Or like, God, I wrote an article about all the receivers that they've drafted before the 3rd round. Or 4th round, because I think Jarius Wright was a 4th rounder. They all seem to be from the SEC, and they all seem to just be terrible. So I do feel like they lucked out with those guys, because you don't expect that undrafted free agent from Minnesota State Mankato and a guy who's undersized and kind of an afterthought from Maryland to become the Moss and Carter for this new generation. They're clearly not as explosive as Moss and Carter, because no one ever will be. Moss was from another planet and was just amazing. But you look at the story of Thielen dragging his feet, watching Moss and Carter trying to make one-handed catches into his beanbag chair as a kid. And you can see how that love of those guys helped him. I mean, he made some sideline catches against the Rams where you're like, wow. It's like Chris Carter all over again. And I don't have the stats in front of me, from Pro Football Focus, but you have to think that we have the best wide receiver duo in the NFL. You have a guy in Cousins who, when he has time, is clearly connecting with these guys and has a lot of faith in them and is giving them a lot of opportunities that Case Keenum wouldn't have. I'm not, looking down on what Keenum did. I've gotten some texts from people saying, I miss Case Keenum because he didn't fumble and he was able to elude pressure in a way that was almost magical. In my head as I'm talking, I see a couple times where he ducked down, spun backwards, and eluded a sack. And the idea that maybe they'd be better off with Keenum, you have to also look at what happened in the Eagles game with Keenum too. He had 2 turnovers that really, almost in a Bills way, put them in a hole that they couldn't come out of, and the defense maybe panicked or overcompensated. But at the same time, the Vikings with Keenum had kind of a situation where they gave him 2 options per pass play. They didn't really give him the freedom to make changes at the line or to actually go through his complete progressions as far as from what I understand. So they had him on a leash. With DiFilippo, they don't do that in the passing game, but without the running game to balance it, you don't really get to see the full impact of DiFilippo's playbook or really what the offense is fully capable of, especially with Dalvin Cook returning. But they do obviously have a ton of amazing plays in the passing game, lining up. Diggs and Thielen, what's great about them is you can line them up anywhere. Thielen obviously is a beast in the slot. And then you throw in a guy like Aldrick Robinson, who I think was the best example of how well Cousins is playing in the pass game. Again, notwithstanding the fumbles, but you bring in a guy in Robinson who Cousins was familiar with from his time in Washington, and he's almost like Greg Williams, who came in that week and had that Hail Mary from Brett Favre, welcome to Minnesota, and then he disappeared forever. You get 2 touchdowns from that guy who's undersized but is a speed demon, who clearly runs good routes, who is wide open, and who Cousins was dropping dimes into. I don't remember if it was the first or second touchdown, but he just dropped that pass right over the DB, and it was oh man. So it's, even talking about it right now, you can tell I'm a little excited. I do think that if this team can figure it out, there's offensively they have the passing attack that they didn't last season. I think the stat was when the Vikings before the season held a team to under 21 points, they were 20-1 or something. That sort of stuff, I don't want to be at the point where I feel like the season is over. And I understand that people don't want to be there either, and I understand that that's where the emotion comes from. But when you have a defense that's predicated on guys last year, I think it was Harrison Smith who said, we all just do our job because we trust the guy next to us to also do his job. And so then we don't have to overextend ourselves, or we don't get out of position because we're not trying to say, I got to cover for Anthony Barr too because he's not playing well. Or Xavier Rhodes, or Mackenzie Alexander. And that's not happening this season, and I think that's why a lot of guys end up being out of position. That's what I also think happened in the Eagles game, where you had a guy like Harrison Smith, an all-pro, who was out of position like crazy on a couple of those touchdowns. And they were just dropping dimes all over the field. I mean, just like the Rams, where they have 3-4 touchdowns over 50 yards. You got a second-year quarterback, or a third-year quarterback, who had, 5 touchdowns, 4 by halftime. It's just not what we're used to, and I don't want people to think that my objective is to be negative. I am just trying to figure out what the hell's going on, and at this point, all I see is negative. Again, Zimmer saying I don't really know what's going on. He didn't need to say that. I mean, that's evident. But, you got to wonder if they can turn this thing around. If they can, God bless them. I really want them to. I want to look back at that article like I look back at some of the titles of the Purple Journal podcast from last season that were so, apocalyptic. But I feel like it's a different set of circumstances. I feel like it's a different reason this team is losing. And I feel like, at this point, things, they might get worse before they get better. We're going into Philadelphia. I get that it's a brutal schedule. We always seem to have a brutal schedule. But like I said, that's not dissimilar to what Green Bay or the Bears even are going to be facing. And so, I think this game is going to be a huge litmus test as to whether or not they've been able to figure this thing out. The Eagles aren't playing at the super high level they were last season, but they just got Wentz back. And, they might even make a trade for Le'Veon Bell, which would help my fantasy team tremendously because if you want to know how much credibility I have, I traded Kamara for him and for what's-his-face, his backup in Pittsburgh. And then I forget what wide receiver I got too. But I was hoping that he would either be traded or, play by now. But Kamara is... I think he's the number one guy in fantasy right now, so there you go. But with Philly, it's a tough opponent. It's a tough place to play. The Vikings historically win those games. They always the year after they play the team in the playoffs. But again, I think it's a huge litmus test to see whether or not this team is going to continue to struggle, or if Zimmer's been able to figure out what's going on in regards to the scheme and in regards to the players that have been struggling. So, with that, I wanted to kind of end the show a little early. It's kind of hard when it's just me, but I want to thank everyone for the support. I do want to thank everyone who commented on the article that I wrote about Zimmer. I love that kind of stuff. I don't want to come off as defensive or angry. I think that our sites are different in that we do allow that debate and that engagement with the writers. We do a live chat for every game that has most of our writers in it. If you want to come and hang out and ask questions, we want to be accessible to you guys because we're fans just like you are. We just happen to write about the team. But all your support means a ton to us. The Purple Morning Joes is part of a new quote-unquote radio station that we started. It's all online, but it's basically everywhere. iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and we've gotten a ton of listens. And it's still, even after 3 years of this, it still boggles my mind that somebody right now is like in their cube at work listening to my voice, and it means a ton to all of us. We are, not to get emotional, but since I'm by myself, I'll say that we all are really going after a dream of covering the team full time, and so your support does really mean the world to us. I want to shout out the other shows that we're doing, Purple Journal podcast that I also host with Joe Oberly and Luke Braun. We have the About the Labor guys who do a post-game show, and Drew from that show also does a lot of cool stuff. If you follow our YouTube channel, which I'll link in the article for this, you can see all the content that we're doing there. But I also did create a page just for the station that has the starting lineup with Giotto. It's a new show from 4 to 6 every Wednesday. We have like 6 different shows that are both live and podcasted on the different resources. So there's a lot of content, and it's something that we want to continue to do. If you've ever thought about writing or doing a podcast, we want to be a platform that people can use to get their stuff out. So you can always contact me as well. There's an email apparently available on the homepage of Vikings Territory, since I got a ton of angry emails about the Zimmer piece. But This has been Morning Joe, I guess. We'll be back on Friday to really break down the upcoming Eagles game a little bit more. We might have a special guest. I was working on that this morning, but I appreciate everyone for listening, and hopefully I'll look back on this show fondly while I'm deleting it and denying it ever existed. So, thanks for listening, and Skol.